So now I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Powering Secure Data Discovery Across a Global Network of Innovators. What will it take? So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Francisco.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to have Jim and Dan over here and talk through the future of clinical data and research, which hopefully is more interesting than that sounds on first note. I'm Francisco Giminez. I'm a partner at 8BC, where I focus on bio-IT and enterprise AI investments. Broadly, 8BC is a generalist tech fund with 5 billion assets under management. And we really look for these transformative companies that are taking slower moving industries and bringing them into the future via using computation data and AI tools and techniques there. And a lot of that requires building the enabling infrastructure to do that, which is why we have Flywheel here. We co-led both their Series B and their Series C, and I've had the pleasure of being on the board since then, and have been really delighted about both the vision and the execution that they've had here. So maybe to start out, I would love to have both Jim Olson here, who's the CEO of Flywheel, and Dan Marcus, the CSO of Flywheel, by virtue of an acquisition, introduce themselves individually. So maybe Jim, if you could start and just talk about what Flywheel does at a high level, and then I'd love to hear from Dan afterwards.
You bet. Thank you, Francisco. So Flywheel, we were originally founded out of Stanford. So in Francisco's backyard, so to speak, in the Bay Area. So Stanford University now about 6 years ago. And really focused on the purpose of the company. The problem set that Flywheel was originally focused on was automating the research workflows. Francisco has referred to that to some degree. We can flesh that out as we go along here. But medical data and medical imaging specifically is it's still true. It was true then. It's largely underserved. There aren't a lot of robust tools for managing that data, getting value out of it, and doing research on that data. And that was the genesis of Flywheel. As it turns out, that's broadly applicable. So clinics and hospitals that do research, life science and pharma companies, all have that exact same problem set. And that's what we help them resolve, is manage that data, connect that data, add intelligence in automated ways to the data, and then perform research, look for innovation, developing new therapies and drugs. And as you'll hear us talk about together, both Dan and I, the teaming up of the two companies kind of brings new capabilities to that overall endeavor.
Awesome, thank you so much, Jim. And then turning to Dan here, you have a sort of storied background in the field. You were previously CEO of Radiologics. I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and then what Radiologics was and why you built it.
Sure. So yeah, I kind of tend to wear two different hats. By day, I'm a professor of radiology at Washington University School of Medicine, where I direct the computational imaging lab. And then I'm also the chief scientific officer now at Flywheel. Within the lab, we do a lot of computational research. We are consumers of the kinds of informatics platforms that we're talking about today. In my own lab, we built an open source informatics platform called XNet, which has been NIH funded for almost 2 decades now. Streamlines a lot of the data management workflows that computational researchers depend on. And we've open sourced it since the very beginning, really so that we could share it with a global community of researchers. Though we realized that was, I guess, back in about 2003 or 4 when we first started doing that, initially with Alzheimer's cohorts, which we can talk a bit more about. But we did start to realize that, as just an open source platform, it had limitations in the kinds of organizations that we could service. So we spun out Radiologics from the lab in 2009 and have been building more enterprise grade versions of the XNet platform since then, with a particular focus on FDA clinical trials, multi-center studies, and really getting closer to clinical systems where the data originates. Jim and I started talking That company is called Radiologics. We started talking between us and Jim back late 2020 about kind of what Flywheel does and what Radiologics has been doing, complement one another, and realized that it'd be really exciting and most impactful if we did it together. And that's really kind of what spurred the merger between our organizations, which we completed here in September. We've been operating together for the past couple of months and really accelerating what we're doing. So very exciting times.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. I love you're effectively like the hipster of AI and medical imaging, since you were doing it before it was cool. I guess, or you got to make it cool. I don't know.
Tell my kids that I'm a hipster. They will.
Maybe touching upon that, Jim, I would love to hear from you. We talked about this a lot. I think the first thing you brought up after we invested was, I want to buy Radiologics.
Great timing, huh?
And I would love to know why that partnership made sense for Flywheel, and then kind of what it's allowed for since then.
Was what both Dan and I have referred to, is creating this global network of discoverable data. One of the chief challenges, not the only challenge, but a chief challenge that healthcare innovation faces, it's increasingly data driven, and getting access to really high quality data, diverse data, is a key challenge. And in bringing together the clients and the installations that Radiologics, its underlying open source core, XNAT, and the Flywheel installs, and on an opt-in basis, making that discoverable and supporting collaboration, data exchange, co-development of models is a really compelling idea. And that's the heart of why Dan and I have teamed up, and the two companies have teamed up.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, as you mentioned that, I feel like I've been listening to the need for data in the biosciences basically since I've been doing research in this space, and I'm sure that Dan, who's been doing it much longer, has also been trumpeting that horn. Can you tell us a little bit about where we are today and contextualize that in history? Dan here, about we've always needed more data, but what is different today? Why is Flywheel and Radiologics the right thing to do today?
That one for me, Francisco? All right, I'll jump in. So yeah, I think it's a few things. Like when we first started with XNAT, the patient cohorts, the sort of research studies we were doing, were literally in the dozens, kind of handful of subjects in imaging exams. Over the past 15 years, that's gone from the dozens, it started getting into the hundreds and into the thousands. And now with deep learning, we're talking about tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of exams. And those are both prospective acquisitions where patients are getting into the scanners for the purposes of research, as well as retrospective studies where we're going out to clinical systems, to the standard of care data, and pulling that in to build advanced algorithms. So really what's changed is just the scale, and that scale has been driven a lot by artificial intelligence applications.
Awesome. So it's basically the tools have improved and they required more data. And so you're saying now people are interested in, it sounds like two things. One is capturing and managing their historical data, which they kind of have in cold store, but maybe haven't made meaningful use of. And then also, are you also saying the velocity and volume of that data is also increasing over time across all these different institutions?
Yeah, it's both of those things, both the ability to generate more data. So you can look at a project like UK Biobank, which is collecting data on 500,000 individuals in the United Kingdom, including imaging on 100,000 of them. So that's just a massive scale that we hadn't seen in the past. And it's partly driven by the ability to do computation at scale, supported by tools like XNAT and Flywheel, as well as realization of the value of clinical data. Clinical imaging back in the early 2000s just didn't have a lot of computational value because the resolution was so much lower. The vendors who are building scanners have really improved acquisition capabilities, and now the quality of imaging is really impressive, and we can do computational things with it. So things are coming from kind of all sides as far as converging on the value of data and the need to manage it at scale.
So this is really interesting because we have this sort of massive existing data that we want to capture, and then there's more coming in so quickly. And the complexity is massive. I think one thing that we see a lot across all industries is that almost all of our companies in some way, shape, or form are trying to solve a generalized form of data integration, because it's more interesting to link separate data sets together than just have a singular one. Dan, I know that you spent a lot of time thinking through this and sort of accelerating R&D and innovation. Can you walk through, what it means to have a lot of data, the induced complexity that causes, and what you have done to sort of manage and tame that?
Yeah, so a big part of it is moving data from the source systems, which is often the clinical information systems, which, from an imaging perspective are well organized, but they're really built towards getting a single patient exam to a radiologist to look at, which is a very different task than us doing it at scale to feed computers. So we need to get the data out of those information systems and into a platform that really scales out to deal with huge volumes of data. And when we're talking huge volumes for a large deep learning study, that may be 500,000 chest CTs, which is many terabytes of data. And to do the compute on that, you're talking about tens or hundreds of GPUs chewing on that data simultaneously. So to feed those GPUs, we need data systems that can both feed data into them fast enough. So that's often the hardware, the actual storage systems, but a lot of it's the information on top of it to tell the GPUs which data you're trying to work with, how you're linking the images with annotations that your radiologists have given you, linking to the various curation streams, managing quality, and which scans represent which body parts, and all the sort of stuff of just kind of getting the data labeled and into a state where you can do computational stuff on it. That's just the imaging sort of side of things. And then if you want to start pulling in your diverse other sorts of data, that means talking with your clinical systems. And often that's sort of unstructured data. So it's your clinician notes or a radiologist dictating a report. And that means applying things like natural language processing to try to structure that data in a way that you can associate it properly with the images. And again, that's tens of thousands to push through NLP and other sorts of tools to get it organized. That involves data systems like what we've been building at Radiologics and Flywheel for a decade now that manage both the complex image structures as well as the annotations and text information that come in more sort of standard database structures.
Dan, can you give us an example of this kind of collaboration that you've described as a case study?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give one actually from my own lab where we've been working very closely across our neurosurgery department, our neurology department, and the radiology department, as well as radiation oncology. So this is pulling together a lot of different disciplines to build a full neuro-oncology work stream that takes in brain scans from tumor patients, including the structural portion of their exam, which shows basically where a tumor is, where it's located, and what the pathology is, with functional images, which show connections between different areas of the brains. We have our computational group on the structural side has been developing ways to automatically segment where the tumor is, where the boundaries of the tumor are, and the different compartments of the tumor. We can then run analytic routines to extract features from that can be correlated with clinical outcomes and molecular status of the tumor. And then our functional group has been working to develop how different the brain connections change with different pathologies, and to help guide surgeons to where functional areas of the brain are. So when they go to remove a tumor in a surgical resection, that they aren't interfering with the key functional areas of the brain, so that the patient doesn't wake up without ability to produce or understand language, for example. And this can also then be used to help guide radiation therapy to minimize functional impact on patients with the radiation treatment. So that's a whole lot of pieces that are involved, different clinical disciplines, different computational disciplines, and different sorts of workflows for working with the data and understanding the overall outcomes. So that's a project that's been going on in my lab and with my collaborators for almost a decade now. And we now have quite a bit of sophistication in being able to segment the tumors and understand the functional impacts of those tumors, and to guide our surgeons and oncologists. And that's all been done on the platforms, the informatics platforms and systems that we've been building. And we now have it fully automated in a way that can be directly integrated into clinical workflows. So those tools originally built by our research groups are now used in a sort of translational way by our clinical groups for patients coming in. And in our hospital system at the Washington Medical Center, we've now treated over 2,000 patients using these assets. So built on the research side, now deployed clinically.
That's absolutely amazing, right? Because I think we've been promised bench to bedside research for so many decades, and to actually execute upon that is quite incredible. That said, it feels like doing that in an academic institution that's sort of verticalized and full stack, that you have collaborators there, seems like it's always hard, but seems an order of magnitude easier than trying to get cross-institutional collaboration. So, Jim, is there actually an appetite for this kind of broadly outside of just an internal academic organization?
Yes, absolutely. The two quick examples, an existing partner client, University of Wisconsin in Madison, using Flywheel as part of their infrastructure. They collaborated with 5 regional hospitals in the Madison area, collecting COVID data. In their case, what they wanted to do was determine whether X-rays rather than CT scans, X-rays being more accessible, quicker, easier to do, whether using X-rays, and could they develop an AI algorithm to identify within those scans the existence of COVID and the severity of COVID, and determine that they can. So, a significant step forward in the fight against COVID. So that's one example. So one institution, a research, academic research institution working with, in their case, regional hospitals. Another example, a pharma company, a large pharma company, most of the pharmas collaborate with research and both clinical trial companies, other research institutions, certainly academic researchers, and have a significant hunger, if you will, for data and innovation, and linking up those partners, relatively difficult to do, and time consuming. And through this broader network that we're describing, meaning Radiologics plus Flywheel together, we were able to connect 2 partners, large pharma company with individual academic researcher, common interest, and the academic researcher was able to bring to the table, this is happening right now, interesting data that is, in terms of just product development and innovation at the pharma company, right on point. And so, without that ability to discover, that work, the availability of that data, that collaboration wouldn't happen. So those are 2 examples.
Interesting. So then, so you're saying here, by virtue of Flywheel's capabilities, you're actually able to enable these kinds of broader cross-institutional collaborations and data exchange. That says to me, there in my mind are 2 major sort of hurdles to deploying this, or challenges that you need to solve. One being the technical hurdles of how do you identify these data sets, manage them, process them. And then the other side is just regulatory and compliance. How do people get comfortable with that? Can you speak a little bit to both of those maybe needs that the industry has? Like, what are the technical constraints on being able to do collaboration? And then what do you have to build into a software platform to solve for the regulatory constraints?
There's several of each type, and maybe both Dan and I can speak to them. So the technical requirements, so the idea, the concept of collaborating and working on the same data, same algorithms at the same time, even if those researchers are located, geographically different places on the globe, that the technology to support that has been in place for some time. A key challenge is that, one, the data is high quality. So it's well-formed, it's organized, it's tagged, well-curated data, as we like to say. That's one particular challenge, and bringing automation to that task is a big part of that. That's a significant challenge that we think that we can help with. But having a common view of that. So often the collaborators have existing data and have intelligence built into that data, a set of tags, a way of understanding insight around that data. And the collaborators, even if data that corresponds to that, not similarly organized, so not a common schema across those, and being able to support that so that there really is correspondence and enough in common across diverse data so that, machine learning models and AI can actually work. Otherwise, the diversity, you absolutely need diversity as part of the mix to be able to develop a robust model. Data diversity, absolutely essential, but there needs to be enough in common, this common schema, a common platform to be able to, get learnings across all of that data.
So you need to essentially, it sounds like, structure the component-wise data. You need to have the common schema to be able to integrate it across institutions. And then you kind of need the storage and compute to be able to actually transfer that across lines. On the regulatory side, what do you have to build here, right? So I feel like frequently the joke with enterprise SaaS is that, the first 90% of the work is building the sort of capabilities infrastructure, but then the remaining 90% of the work is building out all the SaaS features needed to actually sell this. And so I'm curious, what do you have to solve for in that?
A permissions model that supports that kind of collaboration so that everyone involved gets access to the data and the algorithms, the processes that they should, and not more. These repositories of data across a network like this, are not just large in size, but a number of different projects involved. So everyone getting access only to what they should, integration with kind of the local credentialing and authentication services. It's a key part of that. Jumping kind of to the compliance part, so having, certainly HIPAA compliant workflows and SOPs in place. The same with GDPR, being able to enforce data localization, a big part of that, especially with European collaborators. All of that infrastructure has to be there to say that, yep, you and I can actually work together in a secure, meaningful way.
So, Dan, you've spent a lot of time in the medical data space. Why isn't relational data good enough? Why do we need complex data?
Well, as Jim said, it's the images are they're a picture, but they're also done over time, right? So the patient will get into the scanner before and after treatment, and we need ways to understand how the shape and volume and other characteristics of a tumor in that image change over time. So that means having to align those pictures taken at different times with one another. You may also get, in addition to, let's say, an MRI scan, you might get a PET scan. So now you're talking about two different time points as well as two different kinds of scanners. So this data gets very complex very quickly and requires a lot of computational engagement with those images to get them into a common space and into a common measurement frame. Relational databases have absolutely nothing to do with everything I just said, right? Like that's, yeah, they're tables, they're columns, they're rows. They're not pictures over time of people in scanners and with different pathologies. So it's like just a completely different world. Now, I will say though, that like one of our tasks is to try to reduce that very complex space into something that could go into a relational database. So how do we get features out of the images that can be compared in a very straightforward way, say with a clinical outcome or with a potential treatment path for a patient? And so that's where a lot of these sorts of applications that Jim's referring to come in, right? Like how do you apply a computational task, let's say a new deep learning algorithm, to extract that kind of features from an image and then use them downstream. And a big part of what we've been building on the platform is ways to deploy those computational routines in very scalable ways, repeatable ways that can be validated and tracked over time to these complex data to get to, let's say, a decision or a classification for a patient or for a group of patients, or to understand the results of a treatment regime or a clinical trial. So that's a big part of what we do, is trying to get that kind of computational routines put into a repeatable process.
What do we get from essentially decomplexifying data into more sort of standardized or structured formats? What does that enable?
Well, it enables more kind of standard statistical approaches, right? Like, so did this patient respond to this treatment? What treatment should we give to this patient? Like, so those are very sort of concrete decisions that depend on getting to sort of discrete measurements from the images. The other thing I would say is that, you know, there's a handful of us out there who kind of like working with the images and who find the sort of complexity of it an interesting challenge. But there's a whole lot more going on in clinical research that isn't really built around that complex information. Is built more towards putting things into more table sorts of formats and working with you know, alongside sort of more discrete information. So our goal is to, you know, reduce that into ways that still make sense to sit alongside more standard measurements.
And so do all areas of clinical practice benefit from managing complex data? Are there certain areas that are more opened up because of this approach?
Yeah, I would say, and I'll let Jim speak to this as well. I mean, I would say this certainly applies across a very broad spectrum of the biomedical regime. There's areas where we've tended to focus more and where, you know, maybe the more immediate applications are really clear. Oncology being one of those. Imaging pretty much is sort of the standard for understanding what is the pathology and how is it responding to a particular treatment. So imaging is just a very deep part of what happens in cancer treatment and patient care in cancer. So it's really amenable to this. It's also happens to be the case that images are very friendly towards deep learning and artificial intelligence applications that are hot right now. And so things that depend on imaging are benefiting a lot from, you know, the revolution that's happening in artificial intelligence. So again, imaging-driven fields like oncology are really benefiting a lot. There are some fields where I think it's going to happen, where it's not happening yet. Psychiatry is one that I think it will happen. Are things happening in the brain that we are able to measure with modern MRI scanners that you can't see as a radiologist. You can't just kind of pull up an image of the brain and understand what form of depression a particular patient might have. But there are computational approaches looking at functional imaging of the brain where I think we will be able to start to extract psychiatric biomarkers. So there's a ton of research happening there, a lot of different studies, both on the academic side and in pharma. We're not quite there yet, but for me, this is like what the next decade looks like, and where for my own interests, of course, we're super excited.
It's hard to have to build the future that you want to live in. So, you know, dovetailing off that, so you talked about complex data types, you know, imaging being sort of a predominant one. but a variety of others that exist within their therapeutic areas that seek to benefit. Talked a little bit about collaboration and how that's really important, sort of driving these research teams. So essentially making data accessible, making it computable, decomplexifying it. And then, one question I have is, what remains here in this step? So what are the huge sort of unmet needs outside of what you just described that organizations are seeking?
Jim, you want to take that one, or is this one for me?
Yeah, let's both kind of riff on this one. I think one significant additional need that we've touched on a little bit is data integration. So we've talked a lot about imaging, complex data types, and so on, but also kind of the more well-behaved data that's in columns and rows and so on. One objective we have is putting those two together. So alongside images, we have a whole set of metadata today, which is arguably that more well-behaved data. But taking the clinical diagnostic data that is in rows and columns, and that there are systems that operate against that data. But I think part of the Holy Grail is putting those data together, literally integrating them. So not just database to database, but patient to patient, subject to subject, so that they are truly integrated, and the unique insights that each type of data, so the clinical diagnostic data, the medical imaging data, the pathology, digital pathology data, and others, start to reveal this 360-degree view of, yes, a patient, but a population. That becomes really, really interesting and kind of a next order opportunity and problem set to solve.
Dan, how about you? What do you think is kind of the sort of untouched upon but unsolved need here?
I think a major thing that's happening in, particularly in clinical trials, and sort of the concept of getting evidence from a much broader range of environments, is the ability to have wearables be part of a clinical trial, that you're not just measuring data at a very discrete time when a patient is coming in for a clinical visit, but that you're able to actually monitor them all the time and with much more complex tooling, right? Like, so we're all wearing our smart watches around and carrying our phones all the time. Those are constantly collecting physiological data that's very relevant to understanding disease and treatments. And I think we have a lot of opportunity based on what we've already built on our platforms to be able to manage that kind of data, again, to extract interesting signals from it, to understand what's happening in patients. And clearly this is already starting to happen in clinical trials, where we're using a lot of different tools to measure effect of drugs. And I see that as being a really interesting part of what we'll be doing in the coming years.
That's awesome. So then essentially you're saying, Jim, on one side, you're saying data integration being sort of huge unmet need of linking things together. And then you're talking about wearables and a lot of sort of maybe non-traditional sources, signal sources, right? And data sources. How do you even go about finding all this stuff? Because I can imagine some researcher in their silo within an organization knows everything they have about, say, mouse data on some experiment they're running, and somebody else knows everything about the images that sit on their packs. But how do you even think to begin to look for and find ways to collaborate both inside of and outside of your institution?
That's part of our immediate vision. This whole idea of data discovery is, we think that surfacing that, meaning have descriptive data information about the work and the corresponding data that someone is doing, being able to surface that and make that accessible across a network. And that's our chief focus right now, is putting in place that discoverable network for data and algorithms. And then when we say opt-in, meaning that individual that has that mouse data, they can describe that and make that available, make that discoverable, and then as it is discovered, gain sponsorship or funding for that project, through collaboration.
Interesting. So essentially you provide, you're saying effectively like a catalog built into the platform as well, such that the discovery can be done in Flywheel along the myriad sort of other things you just described you can do.
Exactly.
Is there anything you can't do?
Not with enough funding and time.
So I like to hear it. We can solve for those things.
Yeah.
As it pertains to what you got today, what data types do you cover, and are able to compute over on the Flywheel platform today? We've talked a lot about imaging and complex data, but maybe going a little more granular, like what exists on the platform today that people are using?
It is a wide range today. I mean, the heart and the kind of the strength of the underlying architecture and tool set cut its teeth, really grew up around medical imaging and all different types. So MR, PET, CT, certainly X-rays, ultrasound. So a number of so that is and has been the heart of our focus. And as I said, that's kind of where the architecture has grown up, the robustness of the architecture, handling complex objects, and then a whole rich set of metadata. But as our client base has grown and as each of our clients, their individual work has expanded, we have clients pulling in EEG data, in digital pathology data, and doing work on that right alongside medical imaging. We've got a large pharma company doing cardiac work and amongst a whole set of other work that they're focused on. So cardiac echo data. It really is pretty limitless. In terms of, we like to say we have a metafile type that we don't like yet, because given the underlying architecture, this complex object and extensible metadata, that's a very flexible approach. So, back to that, or connecting with the data integration topic that we were just touching on, the market is already going there. The client need set is already going there and layering in additional types of data, on the same platform, in the same tool set.
So in my mind, sort of the logical next step here, if you've got the collaboration, you've got the workflow tools built in, you've got the installations across all these institutions, is how do you open up this platform for others to work on top of? Do you seek to be essentially the pipes and the infrastructure for internal, collaboration and communication, or are there ways that this platform can be used to sort of enable the broader research community?
Yeah, we believe so, that the answer to that question is yes, that the kind of discoverable network, supporting the collaboration that we're talking about across institutions and among institutions, it's just a kind of a superset of the same problem set within a large enterprise. And this exists on campus also. Often researchers, academic researchers, frequently, they're collaborating not just with others in their department or across campus, but across the globe. And requires the same kind of tool set. And what we're looking to do is just kind of supercharge that, bring those capabilities up another notch or two. So to create that discoverable, the catalog, I like, Francisco, the way you're voicing that discoverable network via a catalog, both for the data and for the models, the algorithms, the tools that go along with that. Make that discoverable, so that just like with data integration, properly curating, characterizing data, we bring automation to the task of collaborating and finding out, who's doing similar things or who's doing adjacent things that I can and should be working with. And then automating that relationship, which today is a very slow process, a very slow human manual process, helping automate that.
That's amazing. Dan, I think we've talked a lot here about things you've been working, most of your career on. And so I'm curious, two questions here. One is Flywheel the place where you can see, say, a culmination of a lot of the infrastructure that you've spent, your life building towards? And then what are you excited about, or what does the world look like when we've solved these infrastructural problems?
Yeah. No, I'm super excited about Flywheel as an organization that can solve a lot of these problems and really scale things to the global level. And part of that is, us coming together from the radiologics and XNet side and Flywheel to support both open source initiatives and being able to support even the smallest labs all the way through to biggest pharma, and really having that be a frictionless activity, so that if some lab in St. Louis is able to create an incredible data set that has value to pharma, that there's easy discovery between there, and that the governance and compliance and intellectual property and security and patient privacy, like all those are built into, right? Like, yeah, they're boring, but they're the things that, like, when we go talk to folks, it is invariably the first question that gets us. Who can see my data, right? Like in questions like that. So you build in from the very beginning those kinds of security and compliance capabilities. So that just eases everybody's concerns, right? Like, and so the technology supports that. It's very transparent. Everybody can see who has their data. They have maintain all data rights to it on the network. So like that all just gets solved, and that means that we can quickly move towards scaling out so that everybody wants to be part of the data network. Once that starts to happen, to me, it's, every patient, every time point, every pathology is going through computational workflows, whether that's, on the research side, whether that's on the pharma side to understand how drugs are working, or directly to patient care. We're really unleashing the power of AI to get to better patient care.
That's so exciting. Jim, what has you most excited for the future here?
A lot, and I agree with what Dan is expressing. And one quick thought is just the opportunity to work together. Radiologics, XNet, and Flywheel have known about each other, since the inception of Flywheel. Radiologics predates Flywheel by about a decade. And we had kind of a friendly competition, in the middle of the market. But the opportunity to work together and tackle the problem sets that we're talking about, it's absolutely tremendous, and it's very exciting. The teams are very excited about it. Some of these next order problems, the data integration problem, creating this global network where, a lot of the challenges and the barriers to collaboration are removed, or at least significantly diminished, so that we really can envision that, where data and, computational science can help, that healthcare challenges of the future, where we can see that, best minds working on best data and tool sets together, creating that kind of a network. I mean, that's just really compelling. It's very, very exciting.
Well, we're absolutely glad to be supporters as we help you build out this kind of vision, and selfishly excited to see what kind of AI stuff we can build when data is finally unified, integrated, harmonized, and all the good stuff that happens, and what that means for the future. So thank you so much, both of you, for walking through this and speaking to Flywheel and Radiologics and how we're going to work together.
Thanks, Francisco.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Francisco.